What shocks most of us when we step into the Viking world isn't the razor-sharp axes or the long ships slicing across the ocean. It's something that completely flips everything we thought we knew. They barely relied on salt to survive. In the modern mind, the Middle Ages are tied to big white barrels of salt used to preserve meat through winter. But for the Vikings, salt was a luxury nearly as valuable as silver, far too rare to build an entire food security system around. And here's the twist almost no one expects. They endured brutal winters and months-long sea voyages, using things we'd casually pour down the drain today. Sour whey, near-freezing winds, dense alder smoke, even bog mud. Scarcity forced them to create a preservation system unlike anything any other civilization used, one that didn't depend on precious resources, but on the very forces of nature that tried to kill them every winter. Once you understand this, you start seeing the Viking world through a completely different lens. They weren't just warriors. They were survival engineers, people who could turn wind, acid, and earth into food walls strong enough to protect an entire community. What made the Viking preservation system almost unbreakable wasn't a single miracle technique. It was the way they built an entire multi-layered survival ecosystem, where each method stood on its own yet supported the others like pieces of an ancient, finely tuned machine. When salt was too expensive to rely on, they didn't panic. They split their entire food needs into different fronts: icy winds to cure fish, acidic whey to tame meat, smoke to seal proteins inside an antibacterial shell, bog mud and permafrost to keep fats stable for years. This idea of breaking the pressure into smaller parts is what made the whole system so hard to collapse. If a wet winter ruined the fish drying season, they switched to whey. If there was excess milk, the whey was fed to their fermentation cycles. If the smoke didn't hold well, they still had the bogs. Each method had a season, a purpose, a limit, but together, they formed a food security network so resilient that even crop failures, storms at sea, or long stretches of warfare rarely pushed the Vikings toward starvation. It wasn't just cleverness, it was strategy, a form of risk management so sophisticated that many modern societies could still learn from it today. If you've ever thought drying fish just meant hanging a few pieces under the eaves, get ready, because the Vikings turned it into a massive ritual that would honestly freak out a lot of modern people. Every winter, when temperatures dropped to around 0 degrees Celsius and icy sea winds slashed against the rocky coast, they raised towering wooden frames called H-gel structures that looked almost like giant bone cathedrals, standing alone under a gray sky. Then tens of thousands of cod were tied in pairs by the tail and hung along every beam, swaying in the wind like sea mummies. Cold wind did what salt never could. It sucked every drop of moisture, every fiber, every vein dry, leaving behind a block of protein so tough you could tap it and it'd sound like wood. No fire, no salt, no chemicals of any kind, just wind, light, and time. And here's the twist most people don't believe. This dried fish can still be eaten after 30 years. That's right, 3 decades. A kind of immortal food so reliable that even later Arctic expeditions copied it. What few people realize is that these fish towers were the fuel behind the entire Scandinavian economy for centuries, and one of the biggest reasons Viking ships could reach Greenland, Iceland, and the British Isles. So imagine this. Someone hands you a piece of stockfish made back in 1995. Would you dare take a bite? Be honest, are you on team I'd try it, or team not a chance in hell? If stockfish were the wind towers that kept Viking communities alive through winter, then dried meat was their second line of defense, but the way they made it was nothing like what we imagine today. The Vikings didn't slice meat into big chunks and hang it casually from the rafters. They cut it into long, thin, perfectly even strips, engineered so that icy wind could pass through every single fiber without leaving behind the slightest pocket of moisture. These strips were hung beside the fish racks or under the eaves, where the ocean wind worked like a natural dehydrator. And here's the astonishing part. No smoke, no salt, no fire, just enough cold and enough wind, and the meat would slowly turn to stone on its own. This meat was called skarpikjöt, and it wasn't just a food reserve, it was a strategic weapon. Whenever war broke out, crops failed, or winter dragged on longer than anyone expected, these dried meat strips could determine whether a family or an entire village made it to spring. Unlike dried fish, the meat had almost no fat. So once fully dried, it became a kind of compressed energy, feather-light, paper-thin, but so nutrient-dense that just a few strips could keep a warrior going for hours of rowing. Here's a detail almost no one knows. Many old sagas describe dried meat stores as treasures, hidden and guarded like silver and gold, because if they were lost in the middle of winter, an entire clan could starve. If cold wind helped the Vikings turn to stone their fish and meat, then during the wet season when the air smelled of seawater and nothing would dry, they had to rely on something most modern people would pour straight down the drain: sour whey. After every batch of cheese or skyr, the Vikings ended up with barrels of pale yellow liquid, sharp, acidic, and pungent. What we consider a waste product became one of their most powerful survival tools. When the rains came, drying meat was impossible. It would rot in hours. So the Vikings cut the meat into pieces, packed it tightly into wooden barrels, and poured in whey until everything was submerged. The lactic acid was strong enough to shut down all decay bacteria,
So after 2
soften the
weeks of
fibers,
fermentation, it
and
should
turn
be
the
ready.
entire barrel into a biological
Let's see.
battleground where good microbes overwhelm the bad. Then the barrel was sealed and buried underground, kept naturally cold for months. When the lid was finally opened, the sour smell was so intense that anyone unfamiliar would step back instinctively, yet inside was clean, soft, safe protein that could be eaten immediately, no cooking needed. This method was called sur, and it's the reason many Viking communities survived wet summers or years when the fish simply didn't come. So tell me, if someone placed in front of you a barrel of meat soaked in sour whey and buried for half a year, would you be brave enough to try it? There's a truth most people would never expect. Inside those dim Viking houses, no windows, low ceilings, wooden walls soaked with sea wind smoke wasn't just something that stung their eyes, it was what kept the entire family alive. When the air was too wet for drying, when whey wasn't enough to preserve meat, when long winters made valuable food mold in just days, the Vikings turned to a force their ancestors had mastered long before them: cold smoke. They built enclosed chambers, lit low fires in the corner, and let thick smoke creep slowly across every cut of meat and every fish, coating them in a thin layer of phenols and aldehydes, antibacterial compounds strong enough to make food nearly immortal for months. But here's the most mysterious part. The Vikings lived with smoke the way others lived with a household spirit. They slept beneath rafters blackened by decades of fumes, wood hardened into charcoal-like armor that resisted insects for generations. Children grew up in rooms where even the thin beams of sunlight came in, tinted with ash. The longhouse became a living organism, breathing through fire, warming through embers, and defending through smoke. Some old accounts even claim the smoke darkened their hair, toughened their skin, and left their lungs carrying the scent of fire for life, but in return, their meat never molded, and their clans never starved. Of all Viking preservation methods, nothing is as chilling or as brilliantly clever as the way they entrusted their food to the bogs. When summer was too damp for drying, when smoke couldn't protect fats, when whey wasn't suitable for butter or fatty cuts, they turned to a place most of us would consider a death trap: cold, deep, oxygen-free peat bogs. The Vikings discovered that bog mud was extremely acidic, extremely cold, and almost completely airless, the three conditions in which decay bacteria simply can't survive. So they wrapped butter, meat, or fat in wooden containers, sealed them tight, and sank them into the plaisance bogs, letting nature mummify their food as if it were encased in stone. And here comes the spine-tingling twist. In those very bogs, archaeologists later found 2,000-year-old human bodies with skin still intact, hair still there, even facial expressions preserved, as if the person had only fallen asleep a few hours earlier. If a human body could remain that intact, imagine what it would do to butter or meat. Several blocks of bog butter dug up after 30-50 years were still edible, waxy, dark like molasses, and carrying a strong earthy smell, but undeniably preserved. Among all Viking survival foods, nothing is as terrifying yet as awe-inspiring as hakarl, fermented shark, made from a species that would poison you instantly if eaten fresh. Greenland shark flesh contains such high levels of urea and TMAO that modern people compare eating it to taking a spoonful of bleach. But for the Vikings, wasting hundreds of kilos of protein in winter was unthinkable. So, they created a survival ritual that sounds like a legend. Burying the shark meat in gravel pits near the coast, weighing it down with heavy stones so the toxins could leach out into the soil, then leaving it in total darkness for weeks to months. When dug up, the ammonia stench was so overpowering even hardened warriors had to hold their breath, but the process still wasn't done. The pieces were then hung on wind racks, where the northern winds washed away the remaining fumes, turning the once toxic flesh into a dry, durable, year-round source of protein. And the astonishing truth, this very food feared, mocked, and avoided by many today is what kept countless generations of Icelanders alive. While many civilizations simply stored food to have enough to eat, the Vikings turned their reserves into something far more powerful, a symbol of status, strength, and the ability to control the fate of an entire community. Wealthy families didn't just show off with tall houses or a yard full of thralls. They displayed their power through the sheer amount of food they could carry through winter. Stabber grain lofts raised high on posts, wrapped in thick timber, completely mouse-proof, weren't just engineering structures. They were silent declarations. Our family never fears hunger. We can feed the whole village if we choose to. Inside the longhouse, the cold cellar was the secret heart of every clan. Only the head of the household, or the most trusted person, held the key. At that point, it wasn't about meat or ale anymore. It was about who controlled survival itself. In times of war, those who held more stockfish and dried meat had a decisive advantage. They could feed more warriors, endure longer sieges, and even buy allies with barrels of food others simply didn't have. On a warship, food distribution was almost political. The strongest fighters, the hardest rowers, or the shipmaster himself got the premium rations. Hard cheese, dried meat, bog-buried butter, while new recruits made do with barley bread and ordinary dried fish. And that tiny difference often decided who stayed standing and who collapsed in the cold sea wind. You might be surprised to hear this. Chances are every week you're accidentally eating Viking food and probably enjoying it as one of your favorites. Norwegian dried fish, hard cheese, fermented butter, smoked meat, all these things we think of as modern are actually direct descendants of the survival techniques that kept the Norse ancestors alive for more than 1,000 years. What was once a weapon against winter, famine, and deadly ocean voyages has now become cuisine, a cultural identity, even a national pride. Today, Norwegian stockfish is still dried on the very same wooden racks the Vikings once built. Icelandic hockerel still follows its brutal, ancient fermentation ritual. And Swedish surf strumming the fermented fish so potent, it's banned in some public places, is still treated as a special guest dish reserved for the brave. What's fascinating is this. Modernization, industrialization, and even deep freeze technology haven't been able to fully replace these methods. Because what remains isn't just a way to preserve food, it's a living heritage.
What do you think, Inspector?
A culinary memory proving
like
that the Vikings didn't just conquer with swords, they also triumphed through the ingenuity behind every bite. And when you bite into a piece of hard cheese, taste a bit of smoked fish, or chew on a strip of dried meat, you're eating the very same things Viking warriors once carried with them as they rode through storms all the way to the shores of England. Now I'm genuinely curious. Out of all the Viking foods that still exist today, which one have you tried, or which one would you dare to try? Share your thoughts below. Who knows, your story might inspire the next video. And if you enjoy these surprising journeys into the hidden corners of history, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss any of the secrets still waiting in the shadows of the Viking Age.